Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're tackling a pretty wild idea. A high-stakes financial experiment where the Federal Reserve is trying to make trillions of dollars literally vanish. I mean, what happens when the world's biggest money printer decides to go into reverse? After creating this absolutely unprecedented wave of money to fight the pandemic's economic fallout, the Fed suddenly had this massive inflation problem on its hands. And their solution? Well, it was pretty radical. They decided to flip a switch and start deleting money from the financial system. All right, so this whole process has an official name, Quantitative Tightening, or QT for short. But really, you can just think of it as the Great Unwinding. It's this incredibly bold plan to shrink the Fed's massive, and I mean massive, $9 trillion balance sheet and basically suck cash right out of the economy. To put it simply, if you remember quantitative easing, or QE, that was the big money printer, right? Pumping cash in to stimulate the economy. While QT is the exact opposite. It's like a controlled demolition of the money supply, all designed to put the brakes on an overheating economy. Okay, so this is the really cool part. How do you actually delete a dollar? I mean, we're not talking about taking stacks of bills and running them through a shredder. No, the whole thing is this fascinating and, yes, slightly mind-bending process of accounting that happens entirely on computer screens. All right, let's break this down. The best way to think about the Fed's balance sheet is like a giant bank ledger. On one side, you've got its assets. These are the things it owns, mostly government bonds. And on the other side, you've got its liabilities. Now, the most important liability here are these digital dollars, what they call reserves, that commercial banks hold at the Fed. And you got to understand, this is the foundational money for our entire financial system.
So here's the magic trick. Let's say a bond that the Fed is holding matures. Step 1. Step 2, the Treasury pays the Fed back. Now, normally, the Fed would just take that money and buy a new bond, right? But with QT, step 3 is crucial. They don't reinvest. They just let the money vanish. So now the Treasury has to go borrow new money from the public, from a private bank. And this is the final step, the big one. When that private bank buys the new bond, it pays for it using those reserves it holds at the Fed. And with a few keyboard strokes, poof, those reserves are extinguished. They're just gone. That's it. The money is deleted from the system, and the overall money supply shrinks.
Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. This isn't the Fed's first rodeo with QT. They actually tried this once before, back in 2017. And, well, to put it mildly, it did not go smoothly. Yeah, that first attempt, it ended in a full-blown panic in what's called the repo market. Now, you have to think of the repo market as the absolute essential plumbing of the entire financial system. It's where banks do overnight lending to each other. Suddenly, rates just exploded, shooting up from 2% to 10%. That meant cash had completely dried up. The system was seizing. The Fed had no choice but to slam the brakes on QT, reverse course, and start pumping money right back in. It was a massive, flashing red warning sign. So fast forward to 2022, and they decide to try again. But this time, it's a sequel on a completely different scale. We're talking about a pace of money deletion that was nearly double the first time, $95 billion a month. And the total balance sheet they had to unwind was twice as big. Everything was supersized. But the Fed thought they had a secret weapon this time around, an ace up their sleeve, if you will. It was this $2 trillion cash buffer. All this cash was basically sitting in a facility called the ONRRP. And the thinking was, hey, we can drain this buffer first, and it'll act like a giant shock absorber, protecting the core banking system from any stress. At least, that was the plan. So this set up this absolutely monumental conflict. You have the Federal Reserve over here hitting the brakes, pulling money out of the economy to fight inflation, and then you have the U.S. government over there flooring the gas pedal, getting ready to borrow and spend trillions more. You can see it, right? These two massive forces were on a direct collision course. And this is where we get into the heart of the crisis scenario. This sets the stage for a massive collision. In fact, a lot of analysts started to see a perfect storm brewing, something that could happen around 2025 that would push the financial system's plumbing right to the breaking point. So let's walk through how a scenario like that could actually play out. Okay, so in this potential future, what's the trigger? It could be something like a massive new government spending package. Just imagine, Congress passes some enormous $5 trillion bill. All of a sudden, the Treasury is forced to go out and borrow a tidal wave of cash. At the exact same moment, the Fed is desperately trying to pull cash out of the system. And the timing here would be absolutely critical. Imagine this huge spending bill happens right after that $2 trillion shock absorber, that cash buffer in the ONRRP, is completely gone. And just to make things worse, maybe there's a government shutdown, so the Fed is flying blind with no good data. Suddenly, the system has zero cushion, no shock absorbers. That's your perfect storm. So what would be the first warning sign, the canary in the coal mine, so to speak? It would likely be the Fed's emergency lending window, something called the standing repo facility. If you suddenly see banks rushing to borrow tens of billions of dollars from it, that's a blinking red light that cash in the system is becoming dangerously scarce. And then the climax. It would look a lot like this chart. That overnight repo rate, remember, that's the grease that keeps the financial system's wheels turning. It would just spike, absolutely skyrocket, breaking clean past the Fed's target range. The plumbing would just seize up. It would be a complete replay of that 2019 crisis, but this time, potentially, much, much bigger. So, faced with a crisis like that, one that threatens the entire economy, the Fed would have absolutely no choice. It would have to surrender. It would have to blink. And in that kind of scenario, the Fed would have to get out there and announce the end of quantitative tightening. The great unwinding would be officially over. And here's the kicker. It wouldn't be because inflation was defeated. No, it would be because the financial system itself was starting to crack under the pressure. So what's next? Well, the Fed would immediately pivot to a new strategy, something they'd call Reserve Management Purchases, or RMP. And they would insist over and over that this is not QE, this is not money printing. They'd frame RMP as just a boring, technical operation, just buying a few short-term government bonds to make sure there's enough grease, enough reserves, for the system to function smoothly. So what's the big takeaway from all this? It's actually pretty profound. The grand experiment, the attempt to get the financial system back to some kind of pre-2008 normal, has basically failed. We are now living in a new era. An era of permanent intervention, where the central bank's balance sheet isn't some emergency tool anymore. No, it's a constant, necessary feature of the system, mostly to help manage the government's massive debts. So the real question we're left with is, what are the long-term consequences of a system that can no longer stand on its own 2 feet?